Well, a truly amazing and evocative piece of art there from Palermo, and complimenti to the people who made that. They're actually, some of them, not all of them, are actually at the top there behind you, most of you. So congratulations to them. We don't often do things like that in this room. Maybe we should do it more often. It really is quite a stunning experience. It's now my great pleasure to open the session and to bid you welcome to the Chamber of the European Parliament. This is the heart of the democratic process in the European Union. And this is a place where big decisions are taken, where lots of big decisions will indeed be taken this year. And it's no accident, I think, that the eye is here. This is a place where a lot of those big decisions can be influenced by what you have to say as we go through this process. I would like maybe to make a few sort of practical announcements just now. I'd like to tell you firstly that the session is web streamed, so it's all going out live on the internet, so be aware of that. We have interpretation actually in 4 languages for this particular session. We have German, which is channel 1 on your headphones, English, channel 2, French, channel 3, and on this occasion we have Russian on channel 4. You'd also see that behind, on the screens behind us we have a Twitter wall. The hashtag for that is iStream, so E-Y-E stream. So if you want to contribute to the Twitter wall while you're in the room, you can join the people who are outside the room who are doing likewise at the moment. Okay, I think that's it for the practical announcements. We want to have, as much as possible, an interactive session today, so I don't think any of us intend to talk very much. It's going to be more about questions from the floor, so just shout, jump up and down, raise your hand, make yourself apparent in any way you can, and we'll try and take every point that comes out of the floor. So the subject of the session here is courage in human rights. And just on that subject, I'd like to tell you that last November in this very place, many of us who were in the Parliament had the chance to meet a truly inspirational and extremely courageous young woman called Malala Yousafzai, a 16-year-old Pakistani girl who stood up for the rights of girls to be educated in her country. I guess you know the story. She was here to receive the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, which is the European Parliament's annual prize to recognise people who fight for human rights. And she was right in front of where I sit now. She was a small, orange-clad figure in the middle of this sea of members of Parliament, standing up to applaud her courage and her conviction and what she had done. And it was one of the more remarkable sights of my own life, I have to tell you. And that's the kind of courage that we're talking about today. She's still, in fact, fighting the fight. As you know, this very week she joined the campaign, the international calls for action to help the Nigerian girls who've been kidnapped there. Another story which is in the news right now. Malala is only one such person, of course, and there are many people across the world who fight for human rights. And many of them, or some of them at least, have been recognised by Parliament's Sakharov Prize. The winners of the Sakharov Prize have actually formed a network for mutual support and joined together to fight and advance the cause of human rights in the world more widely. And I'm very lucky and privileged today to be joined by 2 panellists who represent organisations who have won the Sakharov Prize. They know all about courage in defending human rights. They know all about what's going on. They know the real stories and the real people who are putting themselves out there for the sake of, in fact, for the sake of all of us. I will introduce them. Firstly, on my left, Kirill Koroteyev. He represents Memorial, which is a Russian civil rights defense organization. This organization won the Sakharov Prize in 2009. On that occasion, three very, frankly, amazing individuals were here to collect the prize. Lyudmila Alexeyeva, Oleg Orlov, and Sergei Kovalev. They were here to get the prize on that day. They were, again, extremely inspirational people. But it's Kirill who's here today. He is the lawyer for the organization, and he represents them and follows their applications to the court, the European Court of Human Rights, which is just across the water here. So that's something else which is in Strasbourg. Of course, it's not an EU institution. It's part of a wider body, the Council of Europe. When the then President Buzek awarded the prize to Memorial that year, he said, "By awarding this year's prize to Memorial, we hope to contribute to ending the circle of fear and violence surrounding human rights defenders in the Russian Federation, and to advance our message that civil society activists everywhere must be free to exercise the most basic rights of thought and freedom of expression." That's what the organisation does. Memorial talks about past political repression in the Soviet Union, keeps those memories alive, and guards against human rights abuses and restrictions of basic freedom in Russia and in other post-Soviet states. Okay, and on my right we have Olivier Basile, who represents Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières. He is the founder of the Belgian branch of that, and their job is to defend freedom of information and the rights of journalists and indeed anybody else to tell it how it is, to tell the truth and be able to express it freely. Olivier is of joint Belgian-French nationality, and he's Director General of Reporters Without Borders in Belgium. Two other things that very interesting things this organisation does: it monitors press freedom around the world, and it keeps a rather grim count of the number of journalists and citizen journalists and netizens who are killed and imprisoned around the world. And just so you know, in 2014, 17 journalists around the world were killed in the course of their profession. 9 netizens and citizen journalists were killed. 173 journalists were imprisoned, and 167, that's almost the same number, of netizens. Something else that Olivier's organisation does is to look at press freedom in countries across the world. And when you look at the ranking, you find it on their website, when you look at the ranking of countries, some of it won't surprise you, but some of the things on there might surprise you. In particular, to find that 5 EU member states are actually ranked lower than 50th on that list, and that is something perhaps we should also encourage us to look at ourselves and how we manage things inside the European Union. That's all I'm going to say, apart from trying to moderate the discussion from now on. Again, I'd be very happy if everybody could intervene, and I'll invite the 2 panellists to say a few words to introduce themselves, maybe tell a story or two, and then we can move on to the interactive part. And I will introduce from time to time questions from Twitter as they come through on the feed as required. So, first you, Kirill.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and it's great to be in the company of so many young people. People like, well, those whom I see very regularly now in Moscow courtrooms, because these are the young demonstrators against repression, against war, who are being now routinely arrested and detained in central Moscow. And you would feel several dozen of Moscow courtrooms. It's great, because every courtroom filled with observers makes the judges behave, well, more reasonably. In fact, well, we are the representatives, me and Olivier, of two NGOs that at different points received the Sakharov Prize, which is awarded in honor of a Russian man, Andrei Sakharov, who was a nuclear researcher, very successful one, and who advanced the technology of that time, military technology in particular, and then became a voiceful critic of the Soviet regime, understanding that what he does could actually destroy the whole planet. So he not only became a critic of the government, he also elaborated ideas for a safe coexistence between different social, different political regimes, for the respect for human rights of everyone here on Earth, and became prosecuted for that, sent to exile, and it was his return from exile to Moscow that marked the reality of perestroika and of the return of then Soviet Union and then Russia to what was then believed to be the return to democratic principles and the civilized world. The prize to Memorial was awarded in 2009. That same year we had lost a colleague, Natalia Istimirova, who was heading Memorial's Grozny office, and she was in charge of monitoring human rights situation in Chechnya, collecting evidence, collecting information about human rights abuses. On 15th July 2009, she was taken from the entrance to her home and found dead later that day. But thanks to her work, many of the abuses by Russian officials, Russian army, became known, and those pieces of information she collected, in fact, led to the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights upholding the rights of the victim and finding against the Russian state. She is now that she is no longer with us, there was a solidarity movement from Russian NGOs, and currently the so-called joint mobile groups operated by the Nizhny Novgorod Committee Against Torture work on the ground and do the same work Natasha did, and they are extremely professional, and they are also able to collect all the necessary evidence of what is going on in modern-day Chechnya, which is often forgotten now, but where there is, if not an armed conflict now, but a dictatorship which tolerates no opposition whatsoever. These days, I also think of another person whose name you might have never heard, and her name is Yelena Rybinina. She died on Sunday. She was behind all extradition cases from Russia. People from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, from other Central Asian states turned to her to look for protection when they were about to be sent back to their countries where they would face torture. And Yelena handled dozens of those cases, both domestically and before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And there are over 3 dozens of judgments from the European Court of Human Rights in those cases, finding that Russia's way of dealing with extradition cases is deeply flawed. And that was something very, very unpopular in modern-day Russia, where defending an Uzbek, a Kyrgyz, well, any person from Central Asia finds not only the risk of retaliation on behalf of the authorities, but is not welcomed by the society in general, which unfortunately remains quite racist. And still, although not a lawyer herself, she was able to do these cases despite the counteraction on behalf of the authorities and the secret services in particular, despite condemnation by the society in general, and very professionally, more professionally than probably many lawyers would do. And that's, not to take much of your time, I would conclude on the idea that courage is, of course, standing in front of the tanks on the Tiananmen Square. I hope you have all of you this image in mind. But courage is also doing your daily work, routinely but professionally, making sure that every detail, every piece of evidence is collected, is presented to the courts, that the case is duly taken to Strasbourg, that the victim receives proper advice and measures are taken to protect him. Sometimes for that you have to really to cut on your personal comfort to be able to go on a fact-finding mission in the middle of the night, as Yelena would do. So if in future you would happen to meet a person working on human rights in Russia, that person would probably name her as inspiration. She was an inspiration for the many, and that courage in doing your work well, despite what the authorities do to you, despite what the society around thinks, but doing the things you think that are right and doing them professionally is an important encouragement for all of us indeed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirill. I'd invite Olivier to say something first, and then we'll move to the questions.
Oui, peut-être en français.
Perhaps I'll do this in French. So you'll then be able to see that our language differences are things that can be overcome. It's a privilege for us and to talk to you about something as complicated as courage, and it's rare as well. For 20 years now I've had the luck to defend people who have this courage. In different countries, journalists of course, but nowadays just straightforward netizens, sources of information, people like you or me who happen to get caught up in something because of their own commitments or because of what they dare to do. What's been in common over the last 20 years, despite all the differences of between these people, their religious and linguistic differences, what they have all had in common, and have told me, is that you don't have to be ashamed of what you think. It sounds basic, but I think that's a first form of courage, to want to think and to stick to your convictions. Of course, you have to be prepared to change them, but you have to also to have the courage to stick to them. And you shouldn't be ashamed of what you are, what you think. Then you shouldn't wait for other people. In many other countries, there's a situation where people recognize that perhaps if somebody had spoken out a bit louder, a bit sooner, things would have changed sooner. And that too is something that is common to all of us. And then the last thing, and the most worrying thing, Steve Clark said it in his introduction, in terms of freedom of the press, freedom of information today, about half the European Union countries are only in the middle of the ranking on freedom of expression. And that obviously shows that we're beginning in Europe seriously to be short of courage, even within the European Union. And this is something that, of course, we can't tolerate because there's no particular reason for it. It's also a dangerous signal. And it's part of what goes on in this chamber, but it's your generation. My generation has still got lots of work to be done. But your generation is going to have to face changes such that no generation has faced before. And you're going to have an enormous amount of work to do because of the digital revolution in terms of freedom of expression and the information revolution, and you're going to have the courage to measure yourself up to freedom of expression. If you look at our indicators, they're getting nearer red than green. And 2 or 3 weeks from the European elections, we're putting forward proposals, and it seems to me more than alarming that we're getting these signals in return. So I think I have to conclude that our generation hasn't been able to do a better job, and therefore it's now all down to yours. What we really want is a debate with you, so I'm going to stop now. I haven't got any particular speech to give you more than this, except to conclude once again that courage is thinking what you want to think. First of all, collect your rights, take your rights in hand yourself, and then enact them collectively. But you don't want to wait for a structure to be set up somewhere to do the job for you. If you act like that, I think we may do better in our position in the ranking. Thank you.
Bon. Merci aussi à toi, Olivier, pour cela. Alors.
Thank you, Olivier.
Straight away, does anybody wish to intervene from the floor? We have number 412, please. Yes, turn your microphone on. And
yes, can you hear me? Fantastic. This is one of the issues, or rather, I would say, masses of the society that are close to my heart, and that is of civic courage and the courage to be able to say no when things have gone wrong. And that is, of course, from the media's perspective, as many respectable journalists fly throughout nations and continents to be able to provide us with the truth of what is going on in the world. But I would like to further the perspective into these small matters of civic courage. One of the things that I would like a comment from the panel in front of us is on the proposed act that has come to several nations in the European Union, which is the Civic Courage Act. That means basically that if you are a bystander at a crime, then you will be punished equally as a bystander, as if you were helping the crime to be done. You have a legal obligation to intervene. My own perspective of that, if I may comment, of course, is that you cannot put courage in a law. Courage must come from within. It must come from the society, from the members of society, and most basically from us, the generation that has to pick up this, pieces of society that has fallen into some kind of secluded, anti-courageous act. And I would very much like to hear your perspective of what needs to be done to ensure that our society becomes a more courageous one and a more solidaric one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Olivier? I'll ask Olivier to comment on that one first, please.
Qu'on puisse pas mettre le courage dans la...
Can we put courage into law? Well, that's clear that we can do that. We can introduce other aspects as well into law within the European Union, not just within this hemicycle here, but we are seeing increasingly from a civic point of view and from a legal point of view, we are seeing the emergence of a whole series of pieces of legislation which prevent us from intervening. There are a whole series of countries who have introduced legislation in this area. There's draft legislation in Romania, for example. 50% of the provisions are being published, positive or negative, are being published, and then we're seeing a whole raft of legislation in the sphere of digital technology which affect your own ability to express yourselves. So we're seeing this emerging in Europe. And we're seeing the emergence of things in policy in Europe which has a real impact on journalistic activities and the way in which journalists function in different countries. It's very different from member states to member states. We as journalists don't have the same rights from one member state to the other. So putting courage into legislation, I don't know about that, but what we would hope to see is legislation which goes in that direction. The legal censorship of our own opinions, if that's appearing in law, you've got a real problem there. Now, of course, there are problems with this throughout the world, but there are also problems with this in our own countries. It's a problem with training, with research, if you look at what's happening in some universities, and it's also a problem for the media. So I think your question is a very good one. I don't have a specific answer for it. I don't have the solution. But the way I see it, we're not moving towards legislation which will protect our freedom of expression. Quite to the contrary, we're seeing a rolling back of our freedom of expression. We're seeing people saying to us what we can say, what we can't say. Now, we're also seeing the emergence of self-censorship within the media, and that's a problem, and it's happening throughout the European Union. I don't know if that's happening within society as well, but I know that we've got people publishing in the internet. You've got issues relating to self-censorship, and that's why blogs are so successful. That's why Twitter is so successful. And the reason for this success is because as things stand at the moment, that's the way things are from a legal point of view. In Bulgaria, no journalist can work in independent media, and many of these journalists now publish through the internet. That's how they carry out their investigations. It's only online that they can publish. But the problem is that they can't earn any money through doing that. So those are the issues which you've got.
Much. Anybody else from the floor? Looking around. Yes, could I take you first, please? 408.
Hello. I would like to ask about the Estrella report, a report about contraceptives and abortion, with a suggestion that wasn't even legally binding. The 22nd of October last year, this report was voted down. Do you, from a humanitarian rights kind of perspective, see a problem with the restriction regarding abortion and contraceptives that is spreading around in Europe? Did you get my question?
You were asking for the panelists' view on the
restriction on abortion and contraceptives all around Europe.
Okay, Carol, you go first.
Yes, if I understand you correctly, and I mean, here I may only express my personal opinion and my personal opinion is that I would, of course, be among those who support Roe and Wade rather than those who are seeking to overrule it. So I find it troubling that the authorities decide instead of people on the issues like those you mentioned, like abortion and contraception. And here, coming from Russian perspective, the situation we have is that such measures not only, there were restrictions on abortions introduced some time ago, but also other restrictive, conservative by their nature measures, like what is now prohibited in Russia and called homosexual propaganda, meaning that you are not allowed to say anything non-critical about LGBT and LGBT rights. Such things are being introduced, and these measures, having been introduced in Russia, find support among European Union politicians, and that is something troubling. And my call would be to you not to allow such measures happening here in Europe, so that Russia will not be able to justify its stance by reference that similar things are happening in the European Union or the United States, for example.
Thanks a lot, Kirill. My admiration for people who preside the European Parliament is going up all the time. It's really difficult to scan the whole room, but with Kirill's help, number 308, please, you had your hand up, and then there was someone over there, 421, and okay, 406. We're collecting a few, and I can't see your number, I'm afraid, but 340. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Ich hätte eine Frage an Herrn Ko.
Question to Mr. Korolev on a very topical subject, which is Russia. As a human rights activist, what do you see the situation in Russia as? Do you feel that you're being persecuted? Are you being threatened by the government? Can one be productive as a human rights activist working in Russia? How does your work go?
Okay. Were any of the other questions in the same area as that one? Okay, we'll just take that question then. Thank you, Kirill.
Thank you. Tut mir leid, ich kann nicht in Deutsch antworten.
Apologies, I can't answer in German. I'm going to answer in English.
Well, in terms of cases, judicial cases you are involved, you can be extremely productive in Russia. There are, like only in late February there were 1,000 of arrests, so that is much more cases than you can reasonably be involved in. So numerically, yes, you can be productive. Then, there is, I think there is little personal hatred on behalf of the Russian authorities. They just don't want anyone to show opposition at all, be that me or someone else. So what happened is that there was a law targeting Russian NGOs called Foreign Agents Act, which was introduced, which says that every NGO which receives foreign funding is a foreign agent, which in Russian means spy. And the authorities now try to certify independent NGOs as foreign agents, which would lead to more and more bureaucratic restrictions on their work, and the very brand is, of course, abusive. So it it affects the work in the sense that you more and more often have to defend yourself rather than defend your clients in other cases, like people being tortured or sent to Uzbekistan for torture, or I don't know, LGBT activists arrested for demonstrating for equality, or whatever the case may be. So that is very time and resources consuming, so that once we have to defend ourselves, it becomes very, very difficult to do the work, but no one promised us that the thing's gonna be easy. So we have to survive in the environment we have, and even though the things are only getting worse, I mean, like 2 years ago we couldn't imagine it would get that worse. Like on 20th February, we couldn't imagine it would be as bad as it is on 7th of May, but this only highlights the importance of enjoying the current moment, because the things will get even worse in future, so that, I mean, tomorrow we are in a better, today we are in a better situation than we are going to be tomorrow. And that is an important sign of optimism for us.
Okay, thank you. Could I go to 421, please, over there, if you'd like to ask a question?
Je voulais juste rebondir.
I'd like to come back to the issue of censorship in Europe, in the European Union. So censorship in the media. This censorship is increasing, but isn't related to the emergence of the internet. The internet is everywhere. Is it not that governments are trying to protect themselves from the increase of the internet?
Sounds like one for you, Olivier.
Non, je crois pas.
No, I don't think so. I think the two things are complementary. It's not internet that brings censorship, it's rather the opposite. In fact, the internet makes it possible to get round censorship. First of all through third countries, and now, unfortunately, also in the European Union we need to do that. I'm not saying that all media, of course, are in a disastrous situation. But it's not so much internet and the speed of the thing which makes for more self-censorship. It's a series of factors. In part it's economic, people say that, but it's only partly true. It's also because, in fact, there's even a French newspaper which has this as its motto: the freedom of the press will only wear out if you don't use it. And the trouble is to ask yourself, are we still using it? Are we ready as European citizens to support that? So once again, the first question is the straitjacket in which we're living. For example, it's impossible now inside this House to talk about freedom of press in a member state. There's Hungary, which is the worst case, but there are a great many other situations where all kinds of resolutions vote through this House, quite rightly, and we're happy about that, and we support it, about a whole series of third countries with a bad freedom of expression situation. But it's getting extremely complicated, not to say impossible, to have a debate here about the freedom of press in the member states, in particular, to have a resolution which ends up condemning a member state. It's been 20 years that we've had cases like this. We've tried to bring them here, and it's become politically impossible for a whole series of reasons. The kind of censorship that I'm talking about, particularly self-censorship, also arises because, of course, once again, journalists need sources. Now, Twitter today is acting like a press agency before. When I was trained as a journalist, you could only get access to AFP, an agency, which was expensive if you were professional. Nowadays, Twitter is free and everybody can sign up, and then you receive a whole flow of information which journalists are using as well. So now you can get most of the source information that journalists are using to do their work. So you can get basically the same sources as we can, and the added value of our work becomes, or remains, and it's still very useful in some countries. What we're doing is becoming more and more complicated because there are, first of all, personal factors of training. There are, secondly, economic situations. There are legal situations. And all of these are heading in the wrong direction. And what's more, the more these things happen, the more we have to the more trouble we have with them, particularly legally. So I think internet is a big opportunity for us. Of course, it undermines the whole economic model of journalism, but that applies to a lot of sectors. I was reading a book today saying that the gold trade is going to disappear because of the internet. But so the internet is changing a whole lot of things about journalism, but it certainly isn't responsible for censorship.
Just a little, just for a second before I ask for the next question, just to take note of what's coming through on Twitter. There's quite a lot of people talking about the need to look at our own backyards, as it were, inside the European Union, what we're doing. It's not only a question of talking about China, Iran, Russia, but also the member states of the EU. Are we doing enough to uphold human rights inside the EU? Shouldn't the EU be stricter with member states violating human rights? And so on. So there are a lot of comments that are coming through on that line, which is a little bit, I think, provoked by what you were saying, Olivier. And then we have, I thought, a very interesting question that came through, which was how to fight force and human rights abuse with words, how to make a real change when confronted with a powerful foe. And one specifically referring to Russia was, how can an individual help Russian civil activists if he or she is not from Russia? Perhaps we'll move to the next question now. We could come back to those questions or see how they relate to ones that are in the room. But there's a clear sort of trend on Twitter as well. So could I now ask, it was number 406, I think, that we were waiting for next. So let's take 340.
Hi. What I wanted to ask about journalism is, how can the governments and the society ensure that when a journalist goes to a hotspot or a conflict area, that his rights are protected and that he doesn't get captured? Because recently there was the case when the Vice journalist was taken captive in Ukraine. Or is it even possible to ensure that journalists are not getting killed and not being held captive just for doing their job and reporting on what is going on all around the world?
L'assurer, c'est pas possible.
You can't guarantee that. Think about all the parties of a conflict. The press is part of civil society. Of course, things have become very complicated. These days, if you're a journalist, you come from a country, and as such you represent a country. That's what causes kidnappings. And that means that people see you as a British person representing the interests of the British government. That's the situation which the press finds himself in. In the past, journalists were very welcome into the field of war, into armed groups of terrorists as well, because it provided them with a link. If you met someone involved in a conflict, you would find that if you met someone fighting there, that they would protect you for several weeks. You could put together your report and then go back. Now, of course, you had a critical approach to it, but journalists rarely found themselves in the situation that they were being taken hostage. The internet's changed everything. all these groups are now in control of their communication. They don't need the press anymore to promote their cause. They themselves organise their message 24 hours a day. And now the journalists who go into war zones are not protected, but they become the enemy and a potential target, because the aim is to send a clear message to the population. The murder of a journalist is no more dramatic than the murder of a civilian. That's what we've always said in Reporter Without Borders. But the reality is that it is different. As soon as a journalist is taken hostage, is kidnapped, there's a big outcry amongst the international press, journalists talking about whether they should stay, whether they should leave. Of course, there are laws in place. The United Nations has introduced a framework, which is an important document. But if you're if you go to cover the Syrian conflict, for example, these rules aren't respected. And the reality is that our governments don't respect these rules either. The conflict in Mali, which was led by the French government, took place against a complete information block. There was no information coming out of the country at that time. So I don't know how we can do anything to protect people involved in conflicts. The world has changed. We're dealing with bloggers, new kinds of people involved in media. Everything is much more complicated for journalists. Journalists are often in conflicts as witnesses. And the basic idea is that the more witnesses you have on a conflict, the closer you are to knowing the truth. Now, the issue of today's discussion is courage. There's one case which you all know about, the Snowden affair. Within the European Union, it's clear what we're trying to do. We've got an individual here who has demonstrated to us the extent to which spying was underway in the European Union. And look what was happening, look at the response of the 28 member states towards Snowden. He wasn't granted asylum in the European Union, he was granted shelter in the Russian Federation, in Putin's Russia. Now, that's got nothing to do with courage. And what signal are we sending out to the world? We're saying that the person who has told us that the two partners, the United States, the European Union, we're not talking about competing powers, we're talking about partners here. What we're saying is that we weren't interested in the individual who provide us with this information, and I think the response has really demonstrated a complete lack of courage.
Okay, I'm guessing we're going to come back to Mr. Snowden. I'd like to just take the word Russia from that last intervention and just like to come back to Russia just for a minute and ask Kirill to reply to a couple of things I mentioned on Twitter, which was, I mean, what can an individual do to help if he or she is not from Russia, and how to fight force and human rights abuse with words when confronted with a powerful foe. I think those two go together quite nicely. If you'd like to respond to that, and then we'll take some more questions. If you'd like to indicate, even while people are speaking, if you want to sort of put up your hand so we can note the number, and then we'll, okay, I've got...
it doesn't work.
313, I had one here, sorry, 305. I'm sorry to give you all numbers, but I haven't really got much choice.
78.
78, okay.
728.
728, okay.
409.
Okay, we've got quite a lot more. Hang on, we'll do that while Kirill is talking, okay?
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I'm often been asked the question of what to do and how to help from here. Well, there are things you can do. Spread the word, because in the European Union there is no unanimity on what's happening in Russia, and in fact quite a lot of people, not being well informed, support the policies which restrict freedoms and very dangerous, in my opinion, for example, to Russian society. And also, the most important thing, of course, to do is not to allow your governments, European Union, United States, Asia, whatever, Africa, not to allow them to adopt under whatever pretext there may be counter-terrorism, money laundering, or whatever it is, not to adopt measures restricting basic liberties, restricting fair trial rights, or any other basic human rights, because every time there is a restriction of liberty in European Union, in the United States, Russian government, Chinese government for that matter, many other governments in, for example, Central Asia, in Africa, would use this as a justification for their own measures, and that would go probably far beyond European or North American. So do not allow your governments to restrict freedoms. And to be more informed about what's going on in Russia, learn Russian. That would not only widen your view on the world, it will also give you access to many sources we don't often have the means and time to translate. And very closely linked to this, the second question, how to fight force with words. Well, words should make sense when being written together. And that should be words that make sense as a piece of evidence, as an application, as a or any text documenting human rights abuses, but documenting them in the most professional and the most correct way possible. Fortunately, unlike back in like 1960s or 70s, we do have some possibilities to raise the issues of Russia's compliance with international human rights to raise those questions at international level. European Court of Human Rights, which is located just across the river from here, is a good example, and that is one way, which is probably not the most successful, but when it comes fighting the force with words, when these words make evidence, when they make well-reasoned applications to the European Court of Human Rights, they help. If not in fighting, then at least in documenting abuses. The European Court of Human Rights has given over 200 judgments on human rights violations in Chechnya. And those judgments are an impressive, if terrible, record of what happened during what is called Second Chechen War since 1999. So the mere fact of existing of that body of judgments gives a message that the abuses will not be forgotten, and that hopefully one day they may be punished, even if this day is not very soon to come, if at all.
Thanks a lot. Okay, we'll come back to the floor now. 406, you've been waiting for a long time.
Hello, I have a question regarding the lack of press freedom in Eritrea. In 2001, a large number of Eritrean oppositional journalists were imprisoned. Among these, the CNN awardee Seyum Sahaya and the EU citizen, Swedish citizen Dawit Isaak, and they are still held captive. What is the EU doing, and what should the EU do? What is possible to allow for the release of these prisoners of conscience? Thank you very much.
C'est très bizarre et en même temps je sais.
It's very strange and very welcome and good that in a chamber like this people start talking about Eritrea. It's absolutely to your credit that you're doing that. Usually we're the ones talking about a country like this and nobody knows anything about it in the audience. Every year in Reporters Without Borders we have a question about whether Eritrea or North Korea is the worst country in the world. And very often Eritrea wins because the regime there, well, it isn't even a regime, it's SAS. And it's repression, not just of journalists, of the whole population, which is simply beyond words. And it's a real problem because it's a problem for the whole of the Horn of Africa. You have a leader who's responsible for a lot of the destabilization in the whole of that part of the world, with all the consequences that you may know. It's Eritreans. You have to consider what they've lived through, these people. These are people who can walk across Africa to Libya to try to get into the European Union, and they sometimes do it through Israel as well, and in the most astonishing circumstances. So obviously you can understand that the European Union has a bit of difficulty in challenging Russia or China. One can see that that's complicated for them. But Eritrea is a country that lives on three things. It lives on the diaspora racket, including people within the European Union. The system is people in the government come to the European Union with visas, but we can't go there. We, not just NGOs, members of the European Parliament can't go there. But they can come here and they can organize this racket through the embassies, through the diaspora. The diaspora has to pay up, otherwise the family at home suffers. This is a country which for years has been living by diverting openly European development aid. There's virtually no monitoring going on. So you get somebody who is walking around the whole time in Europe, and a country where no international organization, no NGO, not even the Red Cross, can visit the Asmara prisons, never mind the Herero. And we've been told for 15 years now, that yes, progress is being made. And you've just said that a European citizen who's been nominated twice for the Sakharov Prize, and the Eritrean authorities say to the European authorities, he's not a Swede. End of story. So you can't talk about him. Can we do anything against Eritrea? Of course we can, yes. In this chamber, what can we do? Well, the only thing that for several years is that the same resolution, the same text has been voted through every year. It's done copy-paste, everybody signs it. It's all good. But a country like that, with all the responsibilities that it has in the Horn of Africa, in Somaliland, in Djibouti, and other places, and let's not please be told that the European aid may still benefit 5% of the population, but as far as everybody else is concerned, this is a country that you should be able to act on. And even there, we're not doing it for reasons that nobody is capable of explaining.
Thank you. Right, it's my role, I'm afraid, to say things like, we have just over half an hour to go, we have 8 people waiting in line with questions, we need to sort of accelerate, we have now 9 people waiting in line with questions. Perhaps some more as well. So could I ask, just to encourage everybody to be really quick, and perhaps I could start grouping the questions, so we'll take 3 at a time, in which case we could perhaps then invite both speakers to intervene. So could I start, please, firstly with, at the top there, please, that's 797, I think it is.
Hello. Yeah, I had a question. We're talking about freedom of speech and human rights around the globe and in Europe. But sometimes I look at the TV and I see Russian lesbian, homosexual and even bisexual people getting beaten, captured and tortured by the Russian government. And how can you approve that as a panel to this cruelty, and what is your opinion about it?
Thanks. Could I now take, please, 313? I think you were waiting in line. Where's that?
Yes, and I will ask this question in French. Monsieur Basile, tout à l'heure.
Mr. Basile, just now you ended one of your answers by criticising the lack of courage within the European Union. So, in response to that comment, but to both the panelists, do you have an experience which you can share with us, which might help us to understand how we can develop the courage which we lack?
One is 305, please.
Oh, thank you. I had a question to Kirill. It's media. So I wanted to know, is it really true that some media is being blocked, and how social media is being monitored in Russia, like Facebook or like Kontakte or Facebook or Twitter? So how serious is the censorship? Thank you.
To that, the second question there, I'd like to just mention a tweet that we had. It was, how can more people be encouraged to engage in human rights like Malala? So it's a question of how do you generate the courage that we need. So that's along a very similar lines. Kirill, please.
Thank you. The situation of LGBT people in Russia merits a separate debate, probably as long as this one. What is the most troubling is that, of course, the most recent pieces of legislation, the so-called prohibition of some homosexual propaganda, even though it is yet to result in fines or other sanctions against LGBT people, it is used as a justification by conservative Orthodox and by nationalist groups to attack every demonstration organized in support of LGBT rights, in support of equality of rights. And I'm involved in a number of cases in Moscow and St. Petersburg where police actually did nothing to protect the LGBT activists from being attacked, being beaten by nationalists, by conservative activists, and it appears that Russian police also shares the idea that there should be no LGBT expression, freedom of expression in the country, not to say equality of person regardless of their sexual orientation. So that is, I mean, a huge problem in itself. And well, most recently this Monday we were able to obtain a conviction of a nationalist activist, criminal conviction of the activist who attacked LGBT person after a demonstration. But the sentence was very mild, and it again sends the message that LGBT people can be attacked in impunity. It is something which we are challenging, against which we are working quite a lot in Russia. And in fact, again, these laws and the violence against LGBT people resulted also, and here I'm happy to conclude this, that there were many people in Russia who were not concerned at all about the LGBT rights or equality, and now they come in support of LGBT people and LGBT rights, which is encouraging. If there can be something encouraging in this whole nightmare which is happening with LGBT people in Russia. Si j'ai bien compris la deuxième question.
If I understood the question, second question right, how to cultivate courage, how to develop courage, I may not have understood it right, mind. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. Everybody has his own different history. Some people, probably many people, have courage as an immediate reaction to something that affects them. But that could be something quite different. It could be a piece of an example of injustice that happens to you. And then you realize that it's just part of a much wider system which your convictions don't allow you to put up with. Or there's another group that's being treated in a way that you can't tolerate, although you don't even belong to that group yourself. But in general terms, I would say that whenever you see something, you will understand that this injustice or this abuse that's going on means that you have to stand on the side of the victims rather than stand with the aggressors. So if you do something for the victims, that can also be good for you, and I would encourage you to do that and do it straight away if these things start again.
There are several websites which are blocked, which are not among the most read probably, but which are important sources of information nevertheless, and that is something very troubling. Well, we do have, of course, the technical means to overcome the blocking, but still it's a problem. It's all the more problematic that independent internet media like Lenta.ru or TV Rain channel came under serious pressure, not direct censorship, but change of owners, withdrawal of broadcasters from the contracts they signed as regards TV Rain and issues related more to technically related to business, but having the background of the government not tolerating any form of dissent or just any form of independent sources of information existing. In fact, it's the most it's more common way of controlling Russian media than direct censorship. As regards social network and popular blogging platforms like Vkontakte, like LiveJournal, they are of course monitored, and on very soon in September there's going to be a Grand Chamber hearing before the European Court of Human Rights where Russian legislation on phone tapping and internet control will be an issue. And I would say that, of course, the NSA affair publicized by Mr. Snowden, only shows that NSA is a timid and restricted by law compared to the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. Then, as I understand, it's technically more difficult to control the posts which are not public and messages, private messages on Facebook and Twitter. So now there are bills in the Russian Parliament either to force foreign social networks to allow access of Russian security services this or that way, either placing their servers in Russia or in any other way, or just banning them outright. Let's hope nothing will, nothing of the kind is not going to become a law. But every restrictive measure you can think of now is now possible in Russia, which in fact means that everything you write on Facebook, you can only write there things that are or that may become public. So you do not post any sensitive information there, of course, and and that is also true for your emails and your private messages. So that's the only way is just not to put any sensitive information there, unfortunately.
Très vite sur votre...
Briefly in response to your question, if you want to cultivate courage, well, this morning we were talking about social networks. For half the world, being anonymous on the internet, that's a really important issue for them. Within our own countries, if we want to generate courage, be it in the digital world, or be it in our everyday lives, you need to speak in your name. You shouldn't use a digital pseudonym. You can play a role in social networks, but you can't think that that's enough. The digital life is so broad. But if you want to show courage, then you've got to do so in the field, if you like. It's not enough to say that it's just the volume's enough, but it's important that in all sectors we go back into reality, into the field to act.
You're putting me in quite a difficult situation because you keep putting your hands up and we've got, I think now, 15 or 16 people in line. And the thing is, you want to hear from them and we want to hear from you. So we're going to take a few. Let's see how far we get. So let's start with 728, please. You asked for the floor. Yeah, please. Could you keep it as brief as you can, please, because otherwise we need to get through.
Oui. Alors, tout d'abord, merci aux...
First of all, thank you to the interpreters behind the glass there. We can't see them, but they're allowing us to have this debate. Quick question then. Most Russians don't seem to be aware of, or at least not disgusted by, infringements of fundamental rights. Can we be brave on their behalf instead of them? Can we revolt on their behalf? And why are most Russians not rebelling against the system? In the past, after all, we were used to seeing revolutions in Russia when necessary or when useful. Why not today?
Thanks. I can see Kirill, he's desperate to answer that question, but I'm going to make him wait. 355, please.
C'est bon? Oui, c'est bon. Bon, je vais parler en français.
I'm going to speak in French. I would like to know, what do you think on about the upcoming elections? What do you think the rise of the extreme right will do to affect human rights. So what's going to happen after the elections? In particular on issues like border control, Lampedusa. Are we going to see that continuing to happen? Is Europe aiming towards establishing safer borders? Can that be reconciled with human rights and the right to asylum?
Okay, thank you. Lots of issues coming out here now. Your near neighbour, 357, please. You asked for the floor as well, I think.
Hello. Pardon, je vais continuer en français en fait.
I'm going to do this in French, actually. If you ask me, Europe should be attractive, should be an example, and should be a vector for virtuous ideas, ideas of freedom or other ideas. If we don't manage to put those ideas over, then Europe's not going to be attractive. I've often heard the panel say, several times now, that for years the situation in some European countries has been impossible to change. You said you've been on the job for 20 years with the Eritrea. And there, every year the same resolution gets passed. But that's a bit discouraging, isn't it? As it gives us the impression that nothing can ever change. And yet, some of us young people want to change things, want to see a better Europe. And you spoke about various difficulties in the way, which you didn't name. But could you put names on them, and can you give us a few pieces of advice about what the levers are with which we can finally make these things move?
Okay, I'm going to keep going. 411, please. You asked for the floor.
Yes, thank you. I think that in all circumstances it's important to think about norms. And one of the norms I think about in Europe today is that government seems to be less and less afraid of their inhabitants, of the people. And this norm is something that governments seem to say, hey, that government is doing it, so why can't we? It kind of makes it more okay. But how can we, the other countries, I think this is wrong, how can we form a stronger norm that kind of contradicts and defeat the hurtful norms? Thanks.
Okay, and I'm going to push the note-taking skills of our panellists by taking one more. Number 3, please.
Thank you. This is for Mr. Basile. In reaction to two things you mentioned. The first one, in the very beginning, being that after your work for freedom of press and of expression, there's a lot of red flags coming up and there's not a lot of productivity happening. And the second one being that in order to be courageous, we can't do it anonymously. You said we have to take over. Our generation has to take over from what is happening now. Are we expected to take over from a complete clear deficit of freedom? How can we do it? And is it possible that it would make sense to look into the anonymous movement? Or is it completely disregarded as something, as just a phase? Thank you.
Okay, can I ask you to respond as quickly as you can? We've still got 11 people waiting, so télégraphique if possible.
Très rapidement, dans l'ordre.
Briefly then, one by one. I'll leave the questions on Russia to my colleague. On the European elections, yes, of course we are concerned about the rise of the extreme right. The only way to combat that is to participate in the elections. I would prefer to live in a European system in which movements which exist are able to speak democratically rather than excluding them. That's the world I want to live in. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the elections. It's clear that we will have a problem if in this hemicycle there is a strong Eurosceptic element. So what can you do? Well, 25th of May, turn out and vote. Yes, pessimism, that's a problem. I don't want to be too pessimistic myself and say that we can't change anything. Of course you can change a great number of things, but what I was trying to do was to make you aware of the issues. Of course, there is a great amount which you can do just by being aware of the problems, but it's time to respond. What levers are available to you? You should do what you're doing now to get involved in political activism. There are other things which I could recommend, but there are other questions to be responded to. The anonymous movement, that's something which we support. Of course, we need that. I'm not saying that we should get rid of anonymity. That's not what I say. My idea is that courage, and this is important in those countries where there is a risk, is that people speaking out need to put a face to what they are saying. And that's what we can do to support other people, because if we are speaking out to support them, we need to do so with our name attached to what we're saying.
Thank you. As regards les droits fondamentaux, la majorité qui n'est
fundamental rights and people who are not aware that their fundamental rights are not being respected. Well, respect of fundamental rights shouldn't depend on majorities or minorities. Fundamental rights belong to the individual, not because an individual is part of a majority or minority, but because that the individual is a person, is a human being. So whatever the majority attitude is in Russia, or the minority attitude, shouldn't affect the defense of human rights. Even the revolutions in Russia showed clearly that it's not a majority that makes a revolution. It's the people who most want the revolution who make it. So you shouldn't be thinking about majority and minority terms. You should be thinking about people, individuals, unique individuals. And they're the ones who can defend and invoke human rights. I'm also worried by the increase in extreme right representation here. Because it's the extreme right that most strongly supports the kind of liberty-killing, freedom-killing policies that are being adopted at the moment in Russia. And we have to fight against that kind of law and that kind of case law every day. And it will be terrible for us if this chamber is filled up with people who support the kind of legislation that we're fighting. As to the possibility or the impossibility of change, no, there is change. Things can change. At the moment, things are getting worse and worse, so you can't say there's no change going on. On the contrary, they're changing for the worse, and they're going to go on changing for the worse. And as to advice, I haven't got any good advice to give you, I'm afraid. What I would say is that you have to give up on the idea of your own comfort. I spent a few years in France, and I think that all French youth wants is stable jobs and bursaries. Sometimes the French police embark on totally racist operations and nobody's in the least bit worried. So if things carry on like that, then change will continue to be for the worse. So my advice to you is renounce your comforts, renounce the idea of a stable job, and you'll find that there's a whole world of possibilities opening up to you.
Can we contradict relativist discourse saying that, well, if one government violates human rights, why can't we? That is precisely why the fundamental human rights are enshrined in international treaties, which means that no government can justify itself legally by referring to another government's failure to comply with international human rights rules, be it European Convention on Human Rights or International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or other regional and international instruments, from American Convention to African Charter to CERT, CEDAW and other UN instruments. So that is the best ground for assessment of each and every state's compliance with human rights obligations, so that references should be made to hard evidence, to the case law of international courts, to the jurisprudence of other human rights bodies, and by referring to what is common for each and every country. It's European Convention on Human Rights in Europe, it's ICCPR for the whole world, that we can say that there are common rules, and if someone breaks them, that doesn't justify this government breaking them. Thank you.
Okay, we're really getting short of time. 797, I've seen that you want the floor again, but I needed to give other people a chance to speak first. I'll try and come back to you if I can, if we've got time at the end. Can we go really quickly, please, and at least we can hear from the people who've asked for the floor, and then if you're quick, maybe we can hear again from the panellists. 27.
C'est une question qui s'adresse.
This is a question for Mr. Basile in particular. Courage. That sometimes requires us to turn our back on our friends. Courage means standing on your own against everyone else. Don't you think that the European Union has become a kind of showed a lack of courage as a whole? Don't you think that's what happened? And looking at diplomatic relations with our European neighbours, or should the European Union not be showing more courage within the European Union and also on the international stage?
Thank you. 263, please. 263. Where is that? That's over here somewhere. Yes, it's in blue there. Yes, it's you.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question.
Good afternoon. My question is similar to one asked a moment ago, but I'll still ask it. We're talking about courage in connection with human rights, but there's also a question of human dignity. How can we young Europeans who live within the Schengen area, how can we have a policy which is bolder, which is braver in terms of the entry and the stay of third country nationals in the European Union?
Okay, thanks a lot. 436, please. It's up there.
Yeah, my question is about migrant policy. It interests me how you or we can separate between people who live inside Europe and people who come from outside Europe, when everyone is declared equal due to the human rights. How can it be possible that we've got the right to choose a job and choose where we want to live, and they do not get these rights? How can people even be declared as illegals?
Great, thank you. 166, please. Right here.
Thank you. Yes, we are here with roughly 5,000 citizens of the European Union, but I think that our generation is much more a generation that likes stuff on Facebook, that likes humanitarian actions on Facebook, but we don't do anything. So how can we support from a grassroots level the Reporter Without Borders?
Liking something on Facebook is not doing anything, right? Okay, 433, please.
Hello. Vladimir Putin's perspective, as I understand it, is that human rights law is applied arbitrarily by Western governments as an excuse to violate other states' sovereignty. Is there any truth to that?
Thanks for that. I'm going to go right to the end now. The questions I have, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to close the list there. And then afterwards we'll just see how much extra time we can get before we close down. 128, please. That's right here.
Okay. Hello. How do you explain that only a few newspapers talked about the transatlantic free trade agreement, even though it's going to have a substantial impact on national and local levels? I thought the question in relation with censorship and auto-censorship.
Okay, 242.
Yeah, so this question is related to Edward Snowden a bit. So we've been talking a lot about freedom of press, and I'm thinking press freedom for whom? Especially now with the war on terrorists, well, the war against terrorism, I think it's quite difficult to say who the press freedom is for, which the case with Snowden definitely shows. And then I would also ask you, because we have a discussion in Finland about an initiative to create safe havens for whistleblowers, so I would also like to hear your thought about this. Thank you.
I hope there's going to be time for that. 301, please.
Bonjour. Good afternoon. My question relates to the rights of the child. I believe the situation is of concern. The position which parents find themselves in, and then you've got people uploading photo onto social networks. No one's doing anything to stop that. Is there anything which governments can do? Can parents do something if they don't want photos of their child appearing on social networks? Thank you.
Okay, we've got 3 and a bit to go. 310, please.
Thank you very much. Meine Frage richtet sich auf die Rolle.
My question is about the role of the European Union when there are human rights infringements outside the European Union and we want political or economic sanctions applied. What happens then? What kind of effect do they have?
Sorry, 239. Is 239. That was right. Sorry, did you? 239. Did you not ask for the floor? Sorry, in that case, I can come back. Could I come back to 797, please? Just for 30 seconds, please, because it's your second bite at the cherry.
Yeah, I had a question. How can the government help us to be courageous if they're taking our freedom of speech away during demonstration by locking us up, fighting for our human rights and following the law? How can we have that faith again in the government?
Faith in government. Sorry, you've got like 30 seconds each to answer all of those questions. Good luck, and we'll see how we go. But I thought it was great to have all the questions in the room.
Moi, je vais prendre pour ce qui est des politiques.
I'll answer the questions on political asylum, and I'll leave everything else to my colleague. Now, we can be proud. The European Union is the leading provider of aid on a global stage, far beyond the US, far beyond other countries. We are the most generous donors. So I don't think that we can say we're not doing anything. That's not true. We're doing a great deal. And that's the same for migrants, asylum policy, it's the same, and it applies for all the countries of the European Union. We've got a real problem, it's true, with Schengen, with borders. Now, what we need is solidarity. At the present time, what happens is that the Spanish, the Italians, the Greeks are told, that's your problem, that's up to you to deal with. Because these migrants arrive in your countries, it's up to you to deal with them initially. So there's been a lack of solidarity. The Swedes, the Finns, the Germans are very keen to promote human rights, to talk about human rights, but when it comes to supporting Spain, Italy, these countries, they don't do enough. So, should we change this? Well, at the present time, Europeans are broadly speaking very generous, and they should continue to be generous. Yes, we can continue to do that, but we need to be careful about what's happening with the money. And I think what we can do is guarantee that our development aid is better used. Because what our aim is to guarantee that fewer people need to leave their countries, to sail across the seas, to come to our countries. That's how we can improve things. On the transatlantic trade treaty, I think the reason why there has been so little reporting on the trade partnership, well, the reason is because there's so little known about it. The negotiations are underway at the present time, and writing about something which you don't know very much about is a real problem. So we don't really know enough to be able to talk about it.
Thanks. I'm going to be extremely indulgent to 409 and give you, I maybe missed you before, I'm sorry if I did, but okay, very quickly please.
Throughout Europe we are seeing discrimination of the Romani people, and EU keeps sending Romania financial aid that is not getting to where it's supposed to be. And we're giving a country that is violating human rights our money, and they're swallowing it without helping the Romani people. And financial aid is a way that EU tries to help a lot of countries, but corruption won't let the money get to where it's supposed to be. So my question is, what do you think is the solution to getting the money to where it's actually needed?
Thank you for that. I have a horrible feeling it's going to be very difficult to answer. Kirill, would you like to?
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm not qualified enough to reply to the questions of budget allocations and measures for Romani people. I'm very sorry. But again, I'm not probably in a position to answer the question of, as someone who is from outside of the European Union, to comment on how people are being divided here from being inside and from being outside. I've been refused job as a person who do not hold European passport, so I'm an interested party more or less in this question. So I would probably, just to keep myself short, I would probably give one answer to the question on effects of sanctions, and we don't know what the effect is going to be, but it's not only the effect which should or should not be the consideration in adopting this or that decision. It's also your government, your own reaction to what is happening, and whether not taking any measure would mean that you, in fact, support the government against which you are asked to adopt sanctions, so that this sort of a moral position should be of much consideration irrespective of whether there is or there is no effect of sanctions. There was a question which in fact contained an answer in itself, but I would just underline it. There was a question about what can you do except liking on Facebook to support grassroots movements. Well, the answer is in the question: just go and do. Go and join and help people on the ground. What can be more evident than this? And regarding the question, how can LGBT people, or indeed anyone else, can have faith in government? Well, you don't need to have faith in a government to go and express yourself, to go and request same rights for people regardless of their sexual orientation or any other distinctive character, race or language or whatever it is. You don't need to have faith in government to do this. You have to have faith in yourself.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Kirill. One from 27 we didn't answer. Would you like to have a go?
Oui, j'ai oublié la vôtre, en plus vous me l'avez.
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot your question, which was more you addressed to me. Courage certainly doesn't mean turning your back on your friends, on the contrary. And that applies also in the European Union. Of course, there's a big difference between Portugal and Bulgaria, or Italy to Sweden. We've unusually in the world have put together a group out of very different countries with very different approaches to a lot of fundamental questions like freedom of speech, for example. Which brings me back slightly to the question of coming from number 263. There's always been this difference of citizenship, but those with rights and those without. We've always been a minority, and we still are a minority. Perhaps that's our strength. We were saying about this, saying this a moment ago. We haven't always, minorities don't always end up losing out. Half the world's population doesn't have access to free information. And even within our 28 countries, we have our problems, but we're still, on the whole, on the better side of that half. But the trend is downwards, and it's time to reverse that.
I can see people leaving. We really are out of time now. I'm going to stop. We've heard about courage. It's been about courage this session. Physical courage, standing in front of a tank, maybe, but there are many other forms of courage. The courage to do your job day in, day out, when it's a grind, when it's tough, when no one's taking any notice of you. The courage not to be ashamed of what you think and your beliefs, and being ready to go forward with them without waiting for authorization from somebody else. There's political courage, sometimes to take action which is not necessarily in your political interests. Economic courage, when it's against your economic interests. The courage to be in a minority, even if the majority are friends of yours. And you might say it's like turning your back on your friends. And someone else said the courage to give up your comfort, which I thought was a nice phrase. And I would add to that the courage to learn Russian. I tried once, but it's a very difficult language. Anyway, look, to finish, it's been a great session. I've been really impressed. It's made my life difficult, but that's what you're here for. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the people on Twitter. And of course, above all, I'd like to thank Olivier and Kirill for their very insightful comments and for provoking you to ask too many questions. Thank you very much.
Hey.